Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first panel of this school, in which we have Professor Otaviano Canuto. My role here is to simply to introduce Professor Otaviano and then to chair the discussions after his presentation. Professor Canuto is actually a very well-known person. Currently a member of the executive board of directors of the World Bank Group, position he has held before between 2004 and 2007. And in this capacity, he represents a very interesting bunch of countries, namely Brazil, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Haiti, Panama, Philippines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. It's a huge responsibility. He has also performed other roles in the World Bank. He has been a member of the board of directors of the IMF, also representing a list of countries, a senior advisor on BRICS economies at the World Bank, vice president for Poverty and Reduction and Economic Management Network at the World Bank, and vice president for countries in the Inter-American Development Bank. He has also been part of the Ministry of Finance in 2003. Apart from that, Professor Canuto he taught at the University of Campinas, where he got his PhD degree, and he has also been a professor here at this university at the Faculty of Economics. So, and he has published and co-edited some 6 books and over 106 book chapters in academic articles, apart from contributing to newspapers and publications. So, let's move quickly. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Alvaro. Thank you, Maria Helena. Thank you, Professor Marta, as well, for having me here. It's really both a pleasure and an honor to talk about a subject that is so key in the understanding of where the world is heading to. But I start by apologizing because I only put on my initial slide SEBRAP, so I should have put as well Missila Center, so I apologize. I will fix it. So the idea today with you guys, and I will try to circumscribe my talk to 45, at most 1 hour, is to approach the fact that we have 2 independent processes taking place. On the one hand, a process that has come to be known as economic globalization, and on the other, you have a very peculiar trajectory in inequality all over the world. And the point is that while on the one hand, over the last decades, 3, the world economy has witnessed such a rapid integration, this has come with a clear rise of living standards in a large number of countries. So there is inevitably a good association made between economic globalization and poverty reduction, while at the same time you also have income inequality increasing significantly in many advanced economies and also in most of those developing countries that succeeded in their process of poverty reduction. So since we have such a coincidence, and the role of my charts here will be to illustrate that with the data. This has led many to link the 2 phenomena and conclude with a dark view about the economic implication of globalization. Point is, we have questions in that regard. First, are those trends in incomes only coincident with globalization, or are they a direct result of it? One thing is to have the coincidence. The other one is to attribute to one the results of the other. Or, ultimately, can globalization lead both to poverty reduction and inequality rise? That's the question that has animated such a wide range of authors and studies. And that's going to be our subject today. First of all, when one looks at the plethora of empirical studies on this, you will not find a clear answer. On the one hand, there is a large literature of empirical studies showing a connection between economic globalization and, as I said, economic growth. You do this with indicators of gender equality, and we'll also find a positive correlation, improving human rights, and so on. The OECD, for instance, and I will appeal to the OECD because it is an interesting case. A study of by the OECD in 2011 found that neither rising trade integration nor financial openness had any significant impact on wage inequality. Then there is another plethora of papers, including another one by the OECD in 2012, which shows an association of liberalization of trade rules and increasing trade flows with higher within-country income inequality. So there is no robust empirical finding across studies. There are several reasons for this. First of all, those studies, they vary a lot in when it comes to the time period, when it comes to the sample of countries included, the data sources, and so on. But there is also two more fundamental reasons that could account for such a variation of in the empirical results. First, standard trade theory suggests that the positive effects of economic globalization are likely to depend on the level of development. And we'll deal with that. Second, some countries develop social insurance institutions to mitigate the adverse distributional effects of globalization. The point is that although, and that's the basic message that I'm going to try to argue here, there is a connection between globalization and inequality results. But globalization itself is not sufficient to explain everything that happens on the side of inequality. And this is quite an important statement because of the political utilization of the arguments of the connection between globalization and inequality in the political discussions all over the world. So what I'm going to do basically is to give you a snapshot of what is that we're talking about regarding globalization, what explains what most economists have called globalization 2.0, and then we move our discussion, our presentation to inequality itself. Let me ask you something. Anybody here in the room has ever heard about the elephant in inequality? Anybody here? Yeah, well, okay. The elephant curve has become the most often quoted chart in international economics, in political circles, since it was presented for the first time by a former colleague, Branko Milanovic, together with another colleague at the World Bank, in a working paper in 2013. After that working paper, the elephant curve became viral, to the point that politicians, one of these days, I saw a video with the Minister of Trade of the Dutch Minister of Trade from Netherlands, referring to the elephant curve to justify a series of measures, trade measures, particularly against imports and against immigration. So the elephant curve has become a quite important economics chart. And I'm going to present it here. I'm going to debunk it. Not me. In fact, I will use several arguments made in that regard. But nonetheless, I will keep on showing some figures that indeed show display a pattern in the evolution of income inequality in most countries in the last few decades. So we'll have to recognize. Then I will spend, to the extent of possible, since we are in Brazil, a short presentation on wage inequality in Latin America, which, by the way, has run against the stream in the new millennium. Although, of course, our starting point when it comes to income distribution, income inequality, you will see, is something out of whack as compared to the other countries in the world. But the fact is that even if temporarily, because the factors behind the phenomenon have dismissed, the fact is that in the new millennium, guess what? Latin America was the only region in the world where inequality decreased. And then I will approach three, without going into detail, three recent empirical studies that have addressed the relationship between globalization and inequality in a systematic way, which might be relevant for our discussion here, okay? So that's my challenge, to do all this, and I hope I can do it. Okay, let's start then with Globalization 2.0. This is a chart that shows the evolution of the ratio of exports plus imports as a share of GDP in the world over the since the beginning of the 19th century. As you can note, there is what people have called, the chart displays both the trade integration in blue, as well as financial integration, the movement of assets and liabilities across the board. For obvious reasons, we will focus here mostly on the trade globalization, on the trade side. Among other reasons, because you guys hear so much about financial globalization, but I can assure you, and I have papers on this, financial globalization is a phenomenon particularly among advanced economies. It's not something that is so keen in the case of less advanced economies. And the fact is, you have no doubt about the fact that something happened in the beginning of the 80s, in the end of the 80s. Something has happened the last 3 decades, along which the trade as a share of GDP, export plus imports of goods and services, have shot to the roof. And that's the phenomenon that has always associated with Globalization 2.0. It's fundamental to understand what's happening, what happened here. Among other reasons, because it's still the evolution of this to the next stage that will have a lot of consequence for all of us, including us, Brazilians. What happened in the end of the 80s? 3 important things, or 2. Let me hierarchize them. First, any guess? End of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, something fell. Remember? A wall that was there in Berlin. In a similar direction, although with no Berlin Wall fall, on the contrary, with tanks at the Plaza de Mayo, but the other one, the Plaza de Mayo de China, you had a similar process in China. Suddenly, you had 1 billion people added to the world economy labor supply. 1 billion. That's a humongous shock. In part of the Eastern Europe, in some parts, with a reasonable level of education and income, whereas in China or other countries that simply propose themselves to integrate trade-wise to the world, you had a substantial amount of cheap, non-skilled labor dying to be integrated into the world economy. Second, there was a certain cluster of technological innovations that made possible the integration, the incorporation of a substantial part of that billion people. These were, there was the revolution in transport associated with the containerization, reducing transportation costs dramatically. But there was particularly the innovations in information technology that allowed for, memorize the word because the word is key, allowed for fragmentation of production processes, allowed for the emergence of value chains. Instead of having the production of an automobile concentrated in one place, to the most, you had the completely knocked down items that came to a place in order to be built there. Instead of having one or two processes, it became possible to break down each and every manufacturing process into several phases and locate those different stages of production in different places in the world. After all, the costs of coordination were minimized with the new technologies. The possibilities of transferring and bringing the technology were also made possible. And the fact is that it became possible for a substantial chunk of the manufacturing processes to be delocated to meet that 1 billion people dying to have some improvement through getting some employment in manufacturing. The third component of this process is the following. Except for Brazil, I insist. Okay, Brazil had a small experiment with trade opening in the beginning of the 90s. But compared to the rest of the world, Brazil did nothing. All those countries in Asia and Eastern Europe, they opened their trade policies. Trade opening, in order to make possible the because you have to understand, a value chain cannot operate unless the intermediate goods can come out in and out to be transformed. To the point that, my iPhone, you know how much of an iPhone is manufactured in the US? Any guess? Zero. Does this mean that the Americans don't benefit from it? The producers? Not at all, because the bulk of the money made with the iPhone is in the technology, not in the manufacturing. But when iPhone contains piece from Korea, from Germany, it's finalized in China. Now no longer, they have moved to other places to avoid the risks of trade wars. But the fact of the matter is that the cluster of technological innovations in the will to incorporate these 1 billion people led to such a huge increase in trade. Now, is that good for the Chinese? Guess what? Compare living in subsistence level activities. Compare this with being captured in the poverty circles that characterize poverty all over the world. Fact is that by simply transferring people from subsistence level activities to simple manufacturing activities, even if at that stage not that much intensive in embedded technology, but allowed just for putting this labor transferred without any major requirement in terms of upgrading skills, this meant a substantial, a humongous increase in productivity. Guess who did the same thing in the past? we did. That's the phenomenon. That's what happened in this country in the 50s until the 70s. That's exactly the same thing that happened, guess what, with Japan after World War II. That's exactly the same process that took place in the Asian tigers, Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, China, Singapore, and it was happening in Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and so on. This is exactly what happened in a fast pace in China, for instance, and in other parts of the world over the last 30 years. One important difference, they did a better job than we did, because they knew that sooner or later this process would exhaust, and there was an uprise in education levels of their population, whereas we never did this. And that's why we're stuck. At the same time, in all these countries, I have a book written comparing Brazil and South Korea 24 years ago when this book was published. And the Koreans changed their model, changed their direction when they realized that the previous model was exhausted. We are still trying to relive the model of the 50s. And that's the worst of all. Our recent experience has been a disaster because people keep thinking in terms of the 50s, as if the model of then could work now. Well, fact is that the structural transformation in those countries outside allow them to lift out of poverty 60 million people and shift to some extent, for a long time, for 3 decades, the center or the configuration of growth, of economic growth. I will show you with the figures in a couple of minutes. One detail, have we in Africa, I say South America and Africa, stayed out of this process? No. We were reached by this process through the super commodity price cycle. So we benefit indirectly through commodity price, which is the good thing and the bad thing about commodity price cycles is that it feels very good when you are in the up. You become more rich without doing anything from night to day by simply because your nature becomes more expensive. Problem. Any cycle of price of commodities has an up and down. And then we are living through exactly a period now in which those prices are down. But let me show you the figures. Look. The left side chart shows how the composition of the increments of the increase in the global GDP has been shifted. As you can see, the share accounted for by emerging markets and developing countries is becoming increasingly bigger, larger than advanced economies. Secondly, even if, the enthusiasm in the immediate period after the global financial crisis was maybe too much, I myself pay a price until today because I published a book in 2010, very much optimistic with respect to emerging markets. Oh, great, thank you. And after that, I have already published 4 more books. Thank you. But everywhere I go, I talk about the other books, but then somebody asks, how about the book of 2010? Because it was too optimistic anyway. But the fact is, maybe I will have some vengeance. I will have the chance to pay back. Because after, look, what does it show here? It shows the line above is the percentage growth of GDP of the emerging markets and developed economies. And the one below is the one for advanced economies. Note that since the beginning of the decade, developing countries and emerging markets have been growing systematically faster than advanced economies. A GDP growth rate higher, ever. Sometimes the difference falls, as it did in 2015, 2016, but it remains, and the forecasts point out to this different pace to keep on. So the income inequality among countries in the world is diminishing. Globalization has reduced the income inequality among countries. Let me show you. I hope you don't mind with this. This is less complicated than it looks. Look, this is the whole population of the world, included in a simple chart. Everyone in the world is allocated there in that global distribution of income curve according to the per capita annual income. This is measured in purchasing power parity, so it takes into account differences among countries and so on. And it compares the global distribution of income in 1988 with 2008. And as you can see, I know it's hard for you to see from the colors, but you can notice that once you have the slides for yourselves, that the curve is shifting to the right. It is. While before we had two peaks, now the first peak is with incomes around $70, $50. The fact is the following. People earning in between $2 and $16 per day has expanded from 1.16 billion people, or roughly 23% of the world population in 1988, to almost 2.7 billion, or 40% of world population 20 years later. Data. This is based on household surveys that the bank collects and does in all countries. In the advanced economies, they do themselves, but also the bank helps countries to do household surveys all over. And to the extent of possible, these data are collected or gathered by the bank. It's one of the public goods that the banks offer, not the only one. Fact is, the population, the middle class, is rising, if you take that as a reference. Of course, this is mainly reflecting, but not only, what happened in China, India, but also other Asian countries. But even here, we have had a substantial decrease of poverty. In this, we will address that. It's a phenomenon that has to do with the economic processes at play. This is data. So my first point, globalization has been good for poverty reduction in the world and for reducing income inequality among countries when you measure average GDP per capita, not necessarily inside. Don't worry, because I will bring bad news as well later. Now, let's go to the elephant curve, known by some of you. Look. In order to understand why it's called an elephant curve, there is even the drawing there, but you don't need that anyway. There you have the whole population divided into the 100 percentiles. Okay, the 100% of the population, right? And then this chart, the original one presented by Branco and another colleague, shows how much income of the corresponding brackets increased in the 20 years between 88 and 2008. For instance, you can see that those situated in the 50th percentile managed to have an increase of their income around 70% in 20 years, which is a lot, right? You also note how the rich are the ones who benefit dramatically as well. But you see on how over 500 million people were brought out of poverty because of the change. Now, this curve also shows the segments corresponding to the 80th and 90th percentile as having stagnated income. Somehow, and not somehow, this curve went viral because those 80 and 90% were identified with the middle classes, low middle classes of US, UK, and advanced economies. And this curve has been associated, has been referred to as an explaining factor for Brexit, for the rise of Trump, for the rise of the right wings in continental Europe, and so on. Because it was even Nobel Prize Paul Krugman, whom I admire a lot. I am a fan of Paul Krugman. 2 years ago, he was giving a lecture at the Peterson Institute for International Economics there in Washington. And then when I saw, até tu, Krugman. Krugman puts this chart to kind of say that globalization had been hurting the Middle America. So it became associated with that. And to explain, now in the final printed version of this work, Milanovic provided an adjusted curve. The picture is not so dire as it is in this elephant curve, but the fact is that indeed those upper middle classes there apparently are the only ones who would not have benefits from globalization. But there is a problem. A problem is the following. The same people who were at the 80, 90 percentile in 88 are not necessarily the same ones in 2008. You have 100% percentiles, okay, but people change, not even the same countries. When you dig more deeply, you will have notes that, and people have done this, a lot of Chinese were already there, as well as the perception is that while the deep America may have stagnated, this has not been the case of middle classes in Europe. And also, one has to take into account the fact that Japan has stagnated for now more than 2 decades, is a country that is shrinking population in terms of population. And not only that, the downfall of the Soviet Empire led to an immediate downfall in incomes in a substantial part of the Eastern Europe right after the end of the Soviet Empire. Why this is important? This is important because it illustrates how there is no such a thing as a simple causation of globalization and stagnation of incomes in the lower middle classes in the US or in England or other parts of the Western world, that has been so politically used to bash immigration, to vote on people like Trump, and now to implement trade policies like the ones that the US are implementing. This is just to show who's who, to reinforce that China and India are the main ones in that portion of the elephant curve. Okay. Nonetheless, Caroline frowned, who went back to the bank. She took the data from Branko Milanovic and estimated how would look the curve, how the curve would look if we take China, take Japan, and take Soviet. And then you can see that the income gains on the even on the upper brackets of the upper brackets of the elephant curve are substantial. So, like Caroline says, let's stop using this graph to highlight the dangers of globalization for most workers in advanced countries. The graph works as a measure of global inequality, showing the remarkable rise of the world's lower and middle classes, especially China. It cannot, however, speak to income gains and inequality in advanced countries as a group, because performance has varied widely. Okay. Nonetheless, am I denying trends with respect to inequality? No, and I will show you why. I will use, I made the following three charts out of a very important report issued last December. It's the World Inequality Report by a team of economists from Berkeley and the Paris Schools of Economics, who could be there? Piketty, of course. You have Piketty and others who have produced the first World Inequality Report. And the interesting thing is that where they could, those guys have applied Piketty's methodology. I presume, well, the work of Piketty had a huge repercussion here as well, right? What Piketty did, to some extent, was to dig into tax records and get a map of the incomes of the top portion of the population, because the typical World Bank household survey is not good for that, because the household surveys, they are based on consumption, patterns of consumption, and so on. And the rich ones, the 10%, particularly the 1%, are not covered by household samples. So what Piketty did, extraordinary work that took him several decades, was to dig in the countries covered in his book through the tax records, a map, a picture of this, of that income by the upper part of the population. That doesn't show up in household surveys. Guess what? In the World Inequality Report, their shortcoming is that the sample that they have is not big enough. It's hard for them to get those. They got to do it in Brazil, but it was a very contested process and hard to repeat. And they didn't get to do the same kind of exercise everywhere in the world. But then they used whatever they had to present this World Inequality Report, and get ready, because the pictures don't look good. Well, first of all, obvious, the elephant curve becomes even less positive. It's important to note the following. They break down the last 10%, the rich 10%, they break down into details so as to demonstrate how to approach the brackets, the small brackets of income of the population. look at, that's how they managed to estimate that the top 1% rich of the world captured 27% of the total growth of income from 1960 to 2013. Someone suggested the following. Instead of an elephant, it looks like more the monster of Loch Ness. Now, let me turn to my own World Bank, and this is the Poverty and Share Prosperity Report issued in December of 2016. And as you can see, now this is serious. Look. Global inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient, everybody? Which is a measure on how unequally income is distributed. The perfectly distributed income would have a Gini 0, and the perfect inequality with the all income being absorbed by 1% of the population would have a Gini of 0. Of 1. Okay, so Gini is always between 0 and 1. And as you can see, overall in the world, the inequality has decreased. While at the same time, the inequality within the countries has increased. The decrease of inequality among countries, that is to say, the difference between average income, the difference between GDP per capita have decreased substantially. And that's why the portion of the global Gini index accounted for inequality among countries has diminished. It's the yellow part. It didn't decrease more because the income inequality within countries has increased. When you take the Gini of the country itself, you have this rise. So it's paradoxical, but it's this. Inequality among countries being reduced, while at the same time, inequality rising within the countries. And we'll show this a bit more. And as you can see, look, the levels of in trends in average inequality are quite different across regions. The developing countries tend to exhibit wider within-country inequality relative to developed economies. Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa, stand out as high in inequality. At the same time, Latin America, at least temporarily, has been the most successful in reducing inequality. And the average industrialized country, the average advanced economy, saw an increase in the Gini index from 30 to 33 between 88 and 2008. Let me show a bit of the World Inequality Report. Get ready. This is an illustration on how inequality varies, and as you can see, the top 10% income share is quite different among the countries, but still lowest in Europe as compared to US, Canada, for instance, and not to speak of Brazil, India, and the Middle East. Guess what? Interestingly, you can notice that the upper case are the ones Middle East, India, Brazil, etc. But look at how income concentration is rising, rose dramatically in India, but also in US and Canada. This is basically US. This is not the case of Europe. So as you can see, the phenomenon of rising inequality, at least as measured by the income of the top 10% of the population, is typically a phenomenon of the US. not continental Europe. But this one is a chart that the report offers, which extends dramatically over time. It's quite interesting for us, the evolution of this index. Look at this. This takes from a broad historical perspective the evolution of inequality as measured by Gini indexes over a time span of the beginning of the last century. Look at how really the after World War II period was exceptional. The evolution was already towards decreasing inequality, and now apparently it looks like the world is converging with the rise of large developing countries, and in fact, in all those countries, you can see the end of the reduced inequality. Of course, this has to do. This makes the following point. Look, instead of trying to understand everything that happens with respect to inequality and poverty reduction, and particularly inequality, by looking at simply trade or globalization, there are other factors that matter a lot, and they are country-specific. Of course, the evolution of inequality in the U.S. has a lot to do with the tax policies adopted since the Reagan era, has a lot to do with the evolution, with the weakening of labor unions, and the change of relationship between members of society in the U.S., as to some extent it has also been the case in the UK, whereas it didn't happen in France. It didn't happen in other European countries. So there's no single model, and that depends a lot on the institutions, on the way by which politics tackle or not the issue within each country. There is no simple, stupid, simplistic conclusion about globalization and evolution of inequality in each of these countries. For instance, this is to take any doubt. It shows the decline of labor shares since 1970 in Germany, Japan, the UK, and the US. This is the extent to which this inequality translates itself into income inequality depends a lot on, as well, on the distribution of ownership of assets, right? It's not simply, don't come with an oversimplistic Marxist capital versus labor, because it's not enough to understand the evolution of income distribution. It has to do, in the case here, with the degree of concentration of ownership or not of productive assets. But the fact is, labor shares are falling. And Industry 4.0 may make this even worse. I'm speeding up, no worries. Interesting, as I said, LAC was the only region in the world where wages became more equal during since the beginning of the century. Interesting, no? And obviously, of course, as I said, there is the Piketty component and the income of the 1% and so on. The income distribution in Brazil looks a lot different using Piketty lenses. And the fact is that most of the improvement in income distribution in Brazil of the 2000s diminished dramatically once you take a Piketty approach. But the fact is that the wages comprise a substantial component of income of the population, and a reduction in wage inequality in Latin America, including Brazil, has a long weight on income, on the profile of income distribution. And guess what? It happened in the region. Quite important. First of all, note how I'm saying region Latin America. It was not simply a Brazilian phenomenon. Even if in Brazil it was really substantial, as you can see on the right side. Second thing that I'm saying, I'm not denying, on the contrary, in the empirical work that I quote, the downside, something also done by the bank, by colleagues from the bank. Empirically, you can find there, you know, because some of you may have done this, I'm acquainted. There are ways by which you dig the data and you make the statistical connections. Now, it is not conditional cash transfers that explains this. It is not Bolsa Familia. The empirical analysis does not deny the importance of conditional cash transfers, particularly as it is targeted at the miserable. And in fact, I have always insisted on this, the major positive benign consequences of things like Bolsa Familia will not be reflected in the short term, but better assuming that really school attendance and health coverage of the kids remains higher, it will show itself not in the parents of the recipients of the Bolsa Familia, but on the evolution of their sons, on the kids in the future. So no way one would deny. I would just say that when it comes to a population like the size of Brazil, like the configuration, it's what happens in the labor market that matters more mostly for income inequality. In that regard, it's not by chance that the whole region had a benign evolution in that regard, because the whole region, the whole South American countries, were impacted by the same kind of phenomenon. And remember when I spoke about the commodity price? That's it. It was good while it lasted. The problem with this is that, as I said, it doesn't stay forever. But while it happened, you had such a wealth effect, and you had a demand for service, you had such a dynamics in the labor market, together with the exchange rate appreciation, price reduction of manufactured goods that make part of the consumption basket, and so on. And then you have definitely real wage going up, and to a substantial part of the population. The expansion of pension coverage also helped, as well as the change in household demographics. The change in household demographics in our country, I don't have to tell you, is a phenomenon. Several colleagues, I'm no demographic pundit, but colleagues at the bank, they always call my attention to this. The speed with which we are getting old has no parallel before. In this transition, we beat even Japan or anyone that you can think. And this evolution speeded up exactly over the last 3 decades. And this has also helped in poverty reduction in the country. So, just to give an idea of the dynamics of inequality reduction in the region, wage inequality dropped by 6 Gini points in the region, which is as large as the difference in inequality between Germany and Argentina, just to give an idea. The 6 Gini points of inequality that we decreased in the region are roughly equal to the 6 Gini points that increased in the US. Just to give an idea how humongous was the inequality rise in the US. Now, problem is, quite important, when you're trying to decompose the factors, there was the pattern of growth, as I said, very much intensive in the demand for non-tradable goods, in the demand for service, and so on. But also the simple improvement in schooling levels also made a humongous difference. I'm not talking about quality. I'm talking about simply, when you look at the cohorts of the Brazilian population by age, and you compare the schooling, the years of schooling, for instance, it's dramatic, the difference between the oldest vis-a-vis the young fellows. Young fellows already have a level of schooling, a number of schooling age. Oldest, without major improvement in the quality. Guess what we could do if we had a better educated, a system with better outcomes. The point is that this simple increase in schooling levels, according to the estimates of the bank, were responsible for a lot of the poverty reduction and of the reduction in wage inequality. We would have to open a new chapter of discussions here if we were to what Latin America or Brazil must do to return to that path, but that's a task for another day. Keep in mind the following, at least one takeaway that I can insist here. What worked well in a period, particularly 2004, 2010, ceased to be that way, and we had a disaster in terms of economic policy formulation after that. And the only way for us to return to a path of growth with inequality will be, an agenda of productivity increase and particularly education, and maybe a tax system less unequalizing. Now the last session. I will talk about three recent studies, very fresh. For instance, this one by two colleagues from the IMF was released 2 weeks ago. And what they do is the following. The interesting thing is that these guys, they did their job. They put the whole data and they try to circumscribe what is, empirically speaking, the relationship between globalization and inequality. So they control for everything else that affects inequality. And what the two important results that they get are exactly that the effects of globalization vary according to the levels of economic development. Globalization impacts dramatically developing countries and less so developed countries. The idea is that the advanced countries who are already integrated in value chains, who are already at a superior stage of globalization, the gains from the recent process at the margin were minimum. Whereas the farther a country is from the frontier, the higher the potential gains from globalization. And the second component of their study was on an association between, on the one hand, the effects of globalization on equality being lower whenever you have social protection scheme. Let me show this. Right. Let me be realistic here. Look at me. The two, I wanna conclude as fast as I can. The two important components in our discussion here is the following, and the three studies that I referred to in the presentation, and the slides will be available. So if you wanna look at them there afterwards. You will be able to trace the papers. I collected them because one is this IMF working paper that I was referring to that shows how asymmetric are the gains from globalization, and secondly, because they show how in the presence of strong protection, social protection systems, the gains from globalization tend to be better distributed among the population. And this has been confirmed as well by another study done by the OECD. That's when I took that chart that singles out the impact of social protection systems. And guess what? They also confirmed the result. They have less of a correlation, a clear correlation in the case of non-advanced economies, which is the left side. And Brazil, in this case, makes a bit the picture because Brazil is a non-advanced economy, but inequality has decreased. So, and Brazil has a protection system you saw in the previous chart, whereas most developing countries don't. But the important thing is the following. On the right side, you have the advanced economies, and there is a clear negative correlation. The higher the levels of government spending associated with social protection, guess what? The lower the inequality. So there's not a single combination. It hinges on the presence or not of social protection. The paper by the IMF, the previous one, showed a similar pattern when it's come to tax and expending. What they show is that countries can change, countries can have a distribution of income different from the one that comes from the market whenever they combine taxes and spending in a counter-inequality way. And there are countries that do this. It's up to the social and political system to do that. And finally, the final study that I want to show is the major flagship of the, or at least one of the major flagships of the IMF, which is the World Economic Outlook. And last year, in October, there are 2 issues per year. They dedicated one special study to inequality. And they went to break down the determinants of the Gini coefficient in the world. And guess what? And what they show is that it is not trade that explained the income concentration. It is particularly technology. The evolution of technology has been such as it economized labor as a major factor responsible for the inequality trends. So don't put the blame on trade. Empirically, the IMF, this is the goddamn IMF, right? The neoliberals, right? They're not so neoliberals anymore. But the fact is that don't put the blame on trade. Don't put the blame on globalization. Put the blame on yourselves if you don't have a social response to an economic trend that comes from the economy, not from trade, that leads to income inequality. So let's concentrate on takeaways to open for some discussion. So if I were to single out which messages I would use as a takeaway, I would say globalization has indeed created opportunities for poverty reduction and lower per capita income inequality among countries. But inequality within advanced and many developing economies has increased. So the global trend towards increasing globalization since the 90s seems to have 2 different distributional consequences. On the one hand, income inequality has declined between countries, while economic inequality within countries has increased. Latin America and the region, and the Caribbean is the only region where wages have become more equal. Quite important. Technological progress has made the biggest contribution to rising income inequality over the past decades. There is no denial of the impact of wages on wages in America, of importing cheap Chinese products. Problem is that when the cheap Chinese products become more expensive, the main losers will be Trump electors, because they will notice the difference of price it came to my mind only Whole Foods. Whole Foods is for the upper class. Give me the other one, Walmart. But the fact is that globalization has had a much smaller disequalizing impact overall, reflecting the offset positive impacts of trade disequalizing in a negative impact. But most and foremost, domestic policies, fiscal policies, social protection are the locus where inequality is to be tackled. This applies to China, US, UK, Brazil, and the moon. Thank you. I got it. Well, less than 1 hour, right?
Perfect, just perfect. Well, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I think we have plenty of issues to discuss here. I was told by the organizers that I could abuse my position here and be the first to pose a question to Professor Canuto, so I will do that. Otaviano, regardless of the right correlation between inequality and globalization, the fact is that, as you mentioned in your position, in democratic countries in the North, the voters, the electorate, seems to be pushing towards a more protectionist, not only from the right, I think the left as well, have been pushing towards a more protectionist policies. This doesn't necessarily has to do with inequality in the case of Europe, but it has to do with maybe in some cases with the deindustrialization of employment in some cases. In other cases, it is due to the measures, austerity measures, and things like that. So my question is, and Mr. Trump has already started a sort of trade war now. He's just starting to do that. So my question is, how do you think countries like Brazil and in Latin America should react to this wave of protectionist policies?
Good.
Shall we open to the floor and collect some questions, and then maybe 3 at a time?
Hello. You mentioned education as a main transition from an old industrialization model to the newer models that you say have worked. I'm curious your take on your own organization's report on what Brazil should do for public universities.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Anybody else?
Thanks a lot for the very good presentation. But I have a question. If you talk about a lot about how trade is not causing the increase in inequality of the top 1% in the world, and how about the financial markets, the financialization of the economy? There are much more money on the financial assets than on the production, and how this can be a possible explanation for the increasing of the top 1%.
Okay. Good.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm still processing the information, but I'd like to know a little bit more about what you mean by middle class, because there is a huge discussion about the concept itself. So when we are talking about those data, how they are defining middle class by consumption. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, great, fantastic questions. On the protectionism and populism and rise of populism, A political scientist from I had to quote because he deserves that. A political scientist from a university in Chile has recently made a podcast at the IMF that I considered brilliant because he says, don't try to understand the rise of populism in advanced economies by looking at impoverishment in those. Because that doesn't explain the rise of populism or the far-right populism in places like Holland, like France. It's prejudice. It's what he calls relative deprivation. Some of these people don't swallow that much the idea that, you know, the rest of the world is improving, whereas they're not. There is an intrinsic prejudice in this. But it's a phenomenon associated not with absolute deprivation, but more with relative ones. These guys, they don't like this idea of, well, what? Now these people will be equal to me? That component, if this political scientist is right, is going to be a harder one to deal with. I'm not making any statement of value, passing any judgment of value, but the fact is that globalization in this interconnection is at the same time leading to this simultaneous phenomenon of search for closeness. The communities in the West, the neighborhoods, who are constituted increasingly by people who look alike, who think alike, sort of a refugee of the invasion of globalization into the kind of social behavior, which will eventually translate, as it has translated, into this anti-immigrant and defense of French values and so on. There was latent there. So populism cannot be entirely explained, and the economics doesn't explain, as I said. Nonetheless, one way or another, people about Trump, these are the two cases. The case of success managed to gain election exactly by building on those prejudices and those false explanations. It's easier to blame the Chinese or the Mexicans than the Americans themselves for the dire straits in which they are with the opioid crisis, in the incapacity of. I have a son who lived for 5 years in Wisconsin, studying at the University of Wisconsin in medicine. We traveled there a lot, my wife and I, particularly because at the time he was dating girls from the region. Fortunately, he ended up dating a girl quite different from those, but we went to the middle of those people are ignorant. They're not well prepared to what's coming, to what it is. I had another son who lived for 1 year in West Virginia. I went to West Virginia. Gosh, that's worse than what you can imagine in hospitals placed inside, let's say, Brazil, in terms of ignorance, but it's easier to put the blame on the Chinese and on the Mexicans. The responsibility of Trump is that he's taking over. If you look at what Trump has announced so far, it looks like he's complying with the election promise, while at the same time it doesn't make any sense. The first measure that he took was against the solar panels and solar cells. You know what? Anyone who has ever visited a solar cell plant, as I did in Korea, it's fully automated. While at the same time, the cost of a solar cell is a fundamental input for the most booming industry in the US, which is building using solar energy. So it's a shoot in the foot to protect 6 firms in China, which will not generate any job. Same thing on the steel, to the point that the guy comes with some announcement, and then the team tries to patch up. Oh, see, they still already changed in a way that, well, we'll take out this, I'll take Brazil, take the laminates from Brazil, and so on. It's simply stupid. The extent to which we're going to have a trade war is not clear. It will depend a lot on how the Chinese will respond. To be seen. I'm still among those who think that this may remain confined to a circumscribed trade war. But it only tells how having response to populism cannot yield good results for anybody. Education and the reference by the bank on public universities in Brazil. I knew that would come. You'll probably have in mind the public expenditure review that the bank gave to the government. The public expenditure review is something that occasionally governments request the IMF or the World Bank to do. It's an analysis on where you can find ways to improve the cost effectiveness of public spending, and the bank does. This one, for instance, that was disclosed last year, was demanded by Dilma. Now, what was that scope? One thing, departing from the consensus that the public spending in Brazil rose from 22% of GDP to 34% of GDP in between 1994 and 2013. The government asked the bank to examine, to see where we could find ways to reduce public spending and or to change the cost effectiveness. And then the bank offered its views, its analysis, in 8 items. The only one who received attention in the media, and you guys, was the goddamn federal universities, public universities. And what the argument says is the following. Look, a possible way to find forms of expanding the spending on other educational areas is to charge something from you guys. Because you can pay or not. Brazil has this, I don't have to tell you, know this by heart, has this perverse system in which the pattern of private-public payments for basic education provides an advantage to the upper part who can pay the private schools. And then when it comes to universities, even if this is diminishing, it's true with the quotas and so on. And then this is changing, but it's changing very little, very little. The bulk of the students of University of São Paulo benefit from their parents being able to put them in a private school, and so you were an advantage at the vestibular. And the fact is that the beneficiaries of the public education, the free, good public university education, is up in the scale. So why not, among other things that are considered there, consider asking them to pay? That's all. There was nothing against public universities, as the syndicates tried to make it out. By the same token, you will find there in the public expenditure review other areas where the government might find the level of bureaucracy in some areas goes beyond any reasonable. The way by which we define our public spending in infrastructure is highly ineffective, and so on. So these are several of the aspects contemplated there. I must confess that I agree 100% with what the report says. If you are to consider ways to improve the cost effectiveness and the poverty impact of public spending, An obvious one is to charge, providing, so as to be able to provide scholarships to those who can't in trade universities. Financial globalization. Definitely the good standing of the upper 1%, it's even more extraordinary in the case of 0.1%. Then the rich of the rich, then you have something really extraordinary. Of course, has to do with the ability that these guys have to do arbitrage, to shift their location, the location of their profits, to locations where taxes are lower and so on. I remember I wrote, when I wrote at the Estado de São Paulo in the 90s, my wife is French, and I teased her, or tried to tease her in that article, because I dedicated to, the title was O Busto de Marianne, the breasts of Marianne. As you know, one tradition in France is to select a beautiful French woman and make her statues, and those statues go to everywhere in public office and so on, as a homage to Joan d'Arc and the women. So a buste de Marianne. And that year, 98 to 99, the scandal is that the model chosen to be buste de Marianne had her savings in London. And the offense for the French, having the lady having the buste de Marianne already distributed to the office, but with her savings located in London, demonstrate quite well how the rich people managed to maximize their gain. By the way, the title of my article at Estadão was A Poupança de Marianne, with a double meaning, pun intended. So the fact that there are several dimensions through which globalization, the liberty has allowed. On the other hand, an interesting thing is the following. You know what has happened with the long-term interest rates in the world since the 80s? They are decline, the long-term real interest rates. It has never been, from the standpoint of return, it has never been worse being a goddamn financial capitalist in the world. It's not making money. Money has become cheap. It may sound odd for us in Brazil, but outside there it is. And if you have the institutional appropriated institutional setting, even in non-advanced economies, you have availability of money. Availability of finance is not a problem in most of the world. It is in Brazil. The problem today is how to find places where to put that money to avoid that they go and make bubbles like they did with the real estate, like they did before with .com and so on. Because in the conventional channels, having money does not mean, even in Brazil, the guys who got rich with the hedge fund industry in the last 2 decades, some of them are already migrating to other areas because money availability, to some extent, financial globalization, which has its perils. It implies, it leads to volatility. It's completely uncommitted. It has a cost. But definitely, financial globalization does not lead to rising interest rates. On the contrary. Middle class. Very good question. The way that I refer to middle class here was too narrow, was the one used by those economists, which is based on levels of income, PPP. So, which may be misleading or may not tell much, they serve to build the curves, but they don't tell much about behaviors, about aspirations, and so on. But having said that, the convergence of patterns of consumption as income rise has amazed everyone. You go to Namibia, you go to China, you go to Brazil, you start from poverty, you want to eat better, you want to have a car, you want to have access to electricity, you want to have access to everything else, leisure, and so on. It's amazing how the convergence of patterns of consumption has revealed itself deeper no matter where you are in the world, for good or bad. So probably, and the fact is, if one look at the prism of patterns of consumption, what you see out there confirms the idea of a rising global middle class. You go to China and you see it. You go even, you go to Brazil and see it. But you're right. Let's not be too narrow with income, definition of middle income.
Move on. Lady. Sure.
Good morning, Professor. I have two questions actually. One of them it refers to service. You mentioned like 2 or 3 times on services, and you had a recent publication whether services would substitute industry in terms of jobs creation, and I would like you to comment a little bit on it, if possible. And the other question regards to these last conclusions. Concerning, you find that domestic policies at the end will balance international forces and inequality pressure. How can, for example, Brazil respond to pressures in against like fiscal austerity, you know? If the answer is this, and you have all pressure coming from markets and from international and domestic sectors, if the answer is this, and are we swimming against the stream?
Okay. Very good.
Sergio. I will ask the audience, while Sergio is posing his question, that the ones who want to speak, to raise the hand so we can close the thing.
So first of all, thank you very much for this really impressive overview of some trends in globalization equality in recent times. I have also 2 questions. The first question is in a certain way following up Alvaro's question on this kind of, I would say, anti-globalization movement from above. So we had a first wave of anti-globalization movements from below, and now you have with Brexit and also Trumpism, a kind of anti-globalization movement from above. And the question is, do you expect any impact of this kind of anti-globalization movement in terms of national policies over your equation between globalization and inequality? So the trends you showed very well in the correlation between globalization and inequality. Do you expect these trends to be changed by this kind of turning point in the national domestic policies in US and also in England? You know, we social scientists, also economists, predicting is not our best specialty, but if you can somehow predict what we expect in this case. The second question is more directly connected with taxes. You mentioned tax 2 or 3 times in your presentation, also in the conclusion, but as you present the correlation between globalization and inequality, it seems to me that the role of national state, it's not really central. Only in the conclusion it appears. And if you take data also from World Bank, you know that if you compare Gini coefficient in European countries, in Latin American countries, pre-tax and post-tax, you see the impact of state. So state matters. State change everything in terms of inequality. The question is how international institutions, no, you are not here as spokesperson of an international institution, but you know that international institutions, World Bank, IWF, the EWF, they don't emphasize very much the importance of tax and taxes policies. If you take the number of papers, you get, 100 papers about cash transfer and 1 paper about taxes. And also the Latin American left-wing governments, they made very, very less in terms of changing very regressive tax structures. Do we have explanation for this?
Yeah, perfect. No, good, fantastic. Let me start with the your question. Then I will go to the service and the fiscal regime. The right-hand chart. I know it's hard to read. Sorry, I apologize for that, but it comes from the IMF paper, and it shows exactly how the income distribution changed dramatically in most advanced economies when you consider the effect of taxes and spending. So it shows how taxes, spending do not eliminate inequality, but they change dramatically. That's exactly why I highlighted that the inequality in the US increased, among other things, as a result of the kind of tax reform that Reagan did. So I don't know if you are not unfair in saying that there is there's so many things produced on the tax systems by the IMF, particularly the World Bank lost capacity in this area. The OECD does a lot as well. I guess the multilateral institutions are not in the extreme, on the ideological extreme that thinks that always says the lesser the tax, the best. No, there is no such. I would say there is a balanced view. And by the way, an interesting component of the whole narrative that I was presenting. Professor Baldwin, who's a professor from Geneva, he has a hypothesis that is quite interesting. It's worth investigating, which is the following. Which advanced countries were impacted by globalization but didn't watch any sort of a rise of populism? Japan and the Scandinavian countries. What do they have different from UK and the US? Effective social protection systems. So the stronger the social protection systems, the stronger the mechanism through which the trends towards inequality are dealt with, you don't feel the compulsion to go against the Chinese getting rich. It's a confirmation of the point that I was making But the fact is that, on the contrary, in all these institutions, OECD, IMF, World Bank, the idea is that the profile of taxes and spending is the way by which, particularly in education, look, the looming threat to employment associated with the Industry 4.0 is scary. Of course, there will be generation of jobs elsewhere, but the potential to job destruction seems to be from what we can see as of now, fortunately we are bad at making forecasts, but from what we can see today, there will be more job destruction stemming from Industry 4.0 than job creation. And the issues that we're talking about, they will get increasingly worse. They may get worse. To the point that the guys in Silicon Valley start talking about, let's call Senador Suplicy, I'm kidding, and propose universal income to everybody, because that's a way, an attempt to mitigate the opposition to technological change. No Luddites. It doesn't. In the 18th century, the Luddites went and threw the machines into the river. It didn't work. The same is going to be if somebody tries to tax robots or tax this or impede the advance of technology. We do have, mankind face a huge challenge. The way to cope with it inevitably will pass by education. One analyst once called it the following: the labor force will be divided into two groups. Well, forget about capital labor. Forget about the old classic Karl Marx dichotomy. You're going to have those people who are creative and the other people who will do personal service to the first people. Because the only jobs that will remain will be the creative ones, and everybody else. Well, the employment structure is already shifting towards leisure and health and so on. So either these societies, and I'm talking about them, the advanced economies, find ways to guarantee that you have some redistribution of income, or we will watch the admirable new world of Aldous Huxley at play. Having said that, this does not confound with levels of spending. One thing is the level of spending, the other one is the composition of spending. Again, a study done by the Ministry of Finance, by Mansueto, that came in the site, is available in the site of Fazenda since last December, shows how, differently from all these countries, it's quite well to do with what we're discussing today, the Brazilian public sector is a Robin Hood upside down. Our state take money from poor to give to rich. So if we're talking about curbing spending as being a bad thing, detached from the quality of spending, I disagree with you. This state that is there, this one that has been rising the GDP, the spending as a share of GDP, from 22% to 34%, rising 60% on real terms year after year, and it doesn't matter if it's PT, if it's Lula, if it's Dilma, if it's Temer, if it's Alckmin, no matter who sits there today is obliged by law to increase the public spending in Brazil by 6% in real terms every year. This is crazy. It was only, we could live with it while GDP was rising 4.5%. So this is to say the following: the issue of cutting spending is not imposed from outside. It's not fiscal discipline from outside. It's we are responsible for doing that to take us to that mud. So there is no other way. The other discussion, we could have the chance, while we examine the level of spending and cut this in unsustainable trend, to also take the chance and improve the quality, which means improve the redistributive impact of what we spend as a public. Our tax system. We have a tax system that falls far short from the redistributive impact that it might have. So let's not confound the two agendas. These are two different agendas. One is the necessary, inevitable revisit to the evolution of public spending, because the current one, the one that has been prevailing since the beginning of the 90s, literally is not bearable. And this is not coming from fiscal discipline from abroad, from institutions. It's for our own good. This agenda should not be confounded with another one, which is how to visit the pattern, the profile of our public spending in our tax system in order to make it less, gear that it's the paradox of lives. The embedded subsidies that went to Brazilian capitalists in the last 6 years, the amount of subsidies was larger than the whole volume of conditional cash transfers distributed. Do you know this? Our state gave more money to the goddamn capitalists in the era of PT than what it did to the poor through conditional cash transfer. This is accounting. See? This is not slogan. It's go there and make the account. This is what has to be changed, and it's not to be. Service, the same. The manufacturing has reached a plateau. To some extent, we here in Brazil have reached this plateau, even precautiously. The problem is that we are competing with Asians who have another level of aspiration and so on. We can't compete. And I don't want to compete. Lula one day was brilliant when he said, "Do you want me to have Bangladeshi kinds of manufacturers? In order to do that, the Brazilian workers would have to have the Bangladeshi wage, and I don't want them to." It's inconceivable at this wage that someone might think. And by the way, those sellers of magic potions, like devalue the exchange rate, must also say that the recipe means exchange rate devaluation means wage compression. They forget to say this. What I wrote in the series of articles on service is that what explains the difficulties or facility to compete in manufacturing is the same thing that explained in service. So either we do our homework in terms of improving our business climate, in terms of lifting the investments in infrastructure, in terms of being less market unfriendly, we're going to be out of service as well. We will not be able even to profit from the possibilities that Industry 4.0 brings through service. That's the basic message. The bar has gone up. We could postpone, we could muddle through, as I'd rather say this in Portuguese, empurrar com a barriga. It's over. There is no more space. Otherwise, we'll keep sinking, and losing ground, And the more we stay engaged in the old discussions, at the time when the world out there has changed, the worse we will be. There is no easy way.
That's it. So I thank you very much, Professor Canuto, on behalf of the organizers, and that's it. That's the end. Would you like to say something, the organizers?